Right. In this video, we're going to be talking about Jim Cummins' contribution to the field of second language acquisition. You didn't have a chance in the readings for this week to dive deeply into Jim Cummins' theories, but he is a major player in the field, and his ideas have really been influential in how we think about academic language in particular, and also how we make sense of the interconnectedness between languages. So he's an important scholar to know. And I wanted to synthesize some of his ideas for you here so that you have an understanding of who he is and what his ideas are. All right. So Jim Cummins is perhaps best known for a distinction that he introduced in the 1970s and 80s of BICS versus KELP. So Jim Cummins is a scholar who was living and continues to live in Canada. And at the time, he was noticing that there was an abundance of students who were language learners who were being referred for special education services. So he wanted to dive a little bit deeper into why this was happening. And he found that many of these students appeared to have mastered conversational English, but were struggling in school. And so they were being referred for special education because teachers believed that, they clearly had mastery of English, the students had mastery of English, but they weren't succeeding academically. So there must be something going on cognitively. And so what Jim Cummins found and argued was that there's a difference between social language, or what he called BICS, basic interpersonal communicative skills, and academic language, or CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency. He argued that BICS develops much more quickly. It's kind of like the language of the playground, the language of kids engaging with one another, whereas CALP is much more challenging to acquire. It's connected to different disciplines and different more academic ways of using language, and that takes time. And just because a learner is taking time to develop it does not mean that they have a learning disability. It's just the natural process of language acquisition. So just to give you an example of kind of what he means by social language versus academic language. So this list, I borrowed this from Levine and McCloskey's book. On the left-hand side, you can see some examples of social language, or language that might be considered more conversational, words like group, guess, watch, show, tell, write down. Whereas a more academic term would be categorize, predict, hypothesize, observe, demonstrate, report, record. So words that children might not be saying to one another, right? Can you categorize these? They might say, can you group this? Or I observed instead of I saw or I watched. So he argued that developing some of this academic language takes more time. And research has shown that to be true. Cummins is not the only one who's looked at this. Others now have looked at how long does it take students to develop academic proficiency, grade level academic proficiency in a new language. And folks have found that it takes 5 to 7 years. Some have said even as long as 10 years to develop grade level academic proficiency. So here you see kind of a visual representation of that, of where the development of a native English speaker versus an English learner, or we might use a term more emergent bilingual, multilingual learner to refer to somebody who's acquiring English as a new language. But you can see the difference in time. Now, I should note, and we'll talk about this in future weeks, that there has been pushback against this kind of nebulous idea of what academic language is. There are folks who have, continued to try to reframe this strict division between BICS and CALP. But it is nevertheless a useful way for us to begin to understand that it takes time to acquire a new language, it takes time to develop grade level proficiency, to be able to use that language for different academic purposes at school. And this is important for us to know as we think about the success and the development of our students who are acquiring a new language. Another related idea that Cummins introduced was this idea of context embedded and context reduced language, and then this spectrum of cognitively demanding and cognitively undemanding tasks. This image that you see is referred to as Cummins quadrants, where he was arguing that the variables of cognitive demand and context impact language learning and the way that students progress from BICS to CALP. So you can see here some examples of different tasks that fall into these different components of the quadrant. So some tasks at school might be context reduced and cognitively undemanding. So Actually, let's look at context embedded first. Context embedded and cognitively undemanding. So there's a lot of context and it's not too challenging, right? So sorting items into categories, reading a simple text with pictures. Whereas if you move to this side of the spectrum, the context is reduced. And it's also not very demanding. So talking on the telephone, buying ice cream. So having a reduced context, or sorry, having a reduced context, but something that is less demanding. And then we move to this side of the quadrant and we see cognitively demanding tasks, either with a lot of context embedded, like solving math problems with manipulatives, or not as much context, like doing a standardized assessment. Or listening to a lecture with no visual support. And so he argued that we really want to try to move into the space of context embedded, cognitively demanding learning spaces, because there's a lot of context. So there's a lot of supports for students as they're learning, but it remains challenging, right? Cognitively demanding. And gradually moving from there towards more context reduced tasks becomes easier once you've had a lot of time working in this quadrant that's context embedded. And this quadrant here is sometimes been called the boredom zone, right? Having a lot of supports and something that's not very challenging. So how do we move towards a space like this? So this is just another way that Jim Cummins has kind of tried to push the way that we think about designing learning spaces that help move students from more kind of conversational language towards academic language with appropriate supports. All right, one other final theory that Cummins is known for is this idea of language interdependence. And this is something that I think a lot about in my work as a translanguaging researcher, because he was really a foundation in the field of thinking about how languages are connected. Cummins proposed this idea of a dual iceberg model to articulate the argument that languages, while they seem different on the surface, so like an iceberg, they may look like separate objects on the surface. Underneath the surface, they are very connected, right? So they look like separate blocks of ice, but they are connected below the surface. So he used this visual to argue that surface features of language look really different, but languages have much more in common than we often realize. He called it common underlying proficiency. And because of this, concepts that are learned in one language can easily transfer to another language because they share so much in common. So what are some examples of things that might transfer, where you might have cross-linguistic transfer? Well, one example is with graphophonic awareness, or the ability to match sounds and text, sounds and letters. So for example, if a Spanish-speaking student knows how to read the word casa, and they know that A can make the sound ah, they can apply that knowledge to the English word wand, where A also makes the same sound. And then they can learn all of the other sounds that A can make in English, including a as an ant, the schwa sound as an umbrella. But they're able to make those connections because language has so much in common that transfers. Syntactic awareness, so an understanding of grammar. So if you understand that sentences have nouns and verbs, they have participants and processes things that happen in sentences, and there's some sort of order in which these things are articulated. Even when you're learning a different language that uses those things in a different order, your understanding of how sentences are structured and the components of them transfers across languages. Vocabulary transfers across languages. And this is so important when we're thinking about Latin-based languages. It's incredible to me how much relationship there is between English and Spanish. English, which is not a Latin-based language, but has a lot of influence from Latin languages, like French and Latin itself, has created a context where English and Spanish have so many words that are cognates. 30 to 40% of words between the two languages are cognates, which means they have the same root, they mean the same thing, and they're spelled and pronounced in a similar way. And so if students learn that vocabulary in one language, if they're given some supports and those words are pointed out to them and those patterns are pointed out to them, they can more quickly learn new vocabulary, right? That knowledge transfers. Early literacy skills also transfer. So even an understanding of directionality in print, that we start at a certain point and we read in a certain direction. Understandings like that transfer between languages. So he argued that there's so much that languages have in common, that we should be thinking about how we can support cross-linguistic transfer and really build upon that common underlying proficiency, rather than seeing these languages as separate, or what he said, kind of the opposing view would be separate underlying proficiency, which he says is not accurate, right? Is not true to what languages actually look like. All right, so that is it. I hope you feel like you know a little bit more about Jim Cummins and some of his ideas that have continued to influence the field, and can begin to think about how you might apply these in your case study.